Life doesn't ask permission before it hits you. A job disappears overnight. A relationship ends without warning. A diagnosis changes everything in one phone call. And in that moment, something becomes very clear. Some people break, and some people don't. This isn't about luck. It isn't about having an easier life or fewer problems. The people who make it through the hardest moments aren't different from you in some special way. They just do certain things differently. They think differently. They act differently, especially when everything feels like it's falling apart. In the next few minutes, you're going to hear real strategies that strong people use when life gets hard. Not vague ideas, not empty encouragement. Actual steps you can use the next time something knocks you down. You'll learn why some people recover fast while others stay stuck for years. You'll learn what to say to yourself when your mind is racing at 3 in the morning. You'll learn how to keep moving forward, even when your hands are shaking and your chest feels tight. Chapter 1. Accept painful moments instead of fighting reality every day. Pain arrives without asking permission. It does not knock on your door and wait for you to say you're ready. It walks in, sits down, and stays as long as it wants. Most people spend their entire lives trying to negotiate with this uninvited guest, begging it to leave, pretending it isn't there, or screaming at it to go away. None of that works. The people who become strong, the people who walk through fire and come out the other side steadier than before, learn something the rest of the world refuses to learn. They stop fighting what has already happened. They accept it, fully, without flinching, and then they use that acceptance as the ground they stand on to build something new. This is not about giving up. This is not about lying down and letting life run over you. Acceptance is not surrender. Acceptance is the first act of real power, because you cannot change what you refuse to see clearly. A person who denies reality is a person who wastes their energy pushing against a wall that was never going to move. A person who accepts reality picks up a hammer and finds the door. Think about the last time something painful happened to you. Maybe you lost a job you thought was secure. Maybe someone you loved walked away without warning. Maybe your body betrayed you with a diagnosis you never expected. In that moment, your mind did one of two things. It either screamed, "This shouldn't be happening," on repeat, or it took a breath and said, "This is happening, now what?" The first response feels natural. It feels like fighting back. But it is actually a trap, because you cannot fight something that has already occurred. The event is finished. The only thing left to fight is your own mind, and that fight drains you dry while changing nothing about your circumstances. The ancient thinkers who studied human suffering long before modern psychology existed understood this with startling clarity. They noticed that it is never the event itself that destroys a person. It is the story we tell ourselves about the event. Two people can lose the same amount of money, endure the same betrayal, or face the same diagnosis, and one will crumble while the other adapts and moves forward within weeks. The difference is not luck. The difference is not even resilience in some mysterious, unteachable sense. The difference is how quickly each person stops arguing with what already happened and starts working with what is now true. I want you to picture two people standing in the wreckage of a house after a storm. The first person stands there yelling at the sky, demanding to know why this happened to them, cursing the wind, cursing the rain, cursing every decision that led them to build in that location. Days pass, weeks pass. They are still standing in the same spot, yelling at a sky that has long since cleared. The second person stands in the same wreckage, feels the same grief, cries the same tears, but within hours begins clearing debris. They do not pretend the storm didn't happen. They do not pretend it doesn't hurt. But they redirect every ounce of energy away from questioning the storm and toward rebuilding the house. 1 year later, the first person is still standing in ruins. The second person has a new roof over their head. This is the difference acceptance makes. It is not a small difference. It is the entire difference between a wasted life and a rebuilt one. Here is something worth sitting with. Pain is unavoidable. Every human being who has ever lived has suffered loss, disappointment, betrayal, and fear. There is no version of your life, no matter how careful or lucky you are, that avoids pain entirely. But suffering, the prolonged, gnawing, identity-crushing kind of suffering that follows people for years, is optional. Suffering is what happens when pain meets resistance. When you refuse to accept what has happened, you take a single wound and reopen it every single day. You are not just enduring what happened to you once. You are choosing to relive it on repeat, and each replay costs you strength you could have used to heal. Real strength is not the absence of pain. Real strength is the refusal to let pain multiply itself through denial. So how do you actually practice this? How do you move from theory to something you can do today in your actual life with your actual problems? Start with naming exactly what happened, out loud or on paper, without any exaggeration and without any minimizing. Most people do one of two things when something painful occurs. They either blow it out of proportion, turning a setback into a catastrophe, or they shrink it down, pretending it doesn't matter when it clearly does. Both approaches distort reality. Instead, write down the plain facts. Not "my life is over" and not "it's fine, whatever." Just the facts. I lost my job on this date. I now have this much savings. I need to find new income within this many months. Facts create a floor you can stand on. Emotional exaggeration creates quicksand. Next, give yourself permission to feel the pain without rushing past it. Acceptance does not mean pretending you feel nothing. It means allowing the feeling to move through you instead of burying it. Because buried pain does not disappear. It just waits underground and resurfaces later, usually at the worst possible moment, often directed at people who had nothing to do with the original wound. Set aside real time, maybe 20 minutes, to sit with what hurts. Cry if you need to cry. Write if you need to write. Speak it out loud to someone you trust. Then, when that time is up, stand up and return to your day. This is not avoidance. This is discipline. You are teaching your mind that pain has a place to exist, but it does not get to occupy every waking hour of your life. After you've named the situation and allowed yourself to feel it, ask yourself one direct question. What is within my control right now, and what is not? This single question, asked honestly, changes everything. You cannot control that your relationship ended. You can control how you spend your evenings this week. You cannot control that your business failed. You can control what skill you learn next and what application you send out tomorrow. You cannot control that your health changed. You can control whether you follow your treatment plan and whether you take care of the parts of your body still working for you. Every situation, no matter how devastating, contains a portion that remains in your hands. Strong people train themselves to locate that portion quickly and pour their energy directly into it, instead of pouring their energy into the portion they can never touch again. There is a practical exercise you can use starting today. Take a sheet of paper and draw a line down the middle. On the left side, write everything about your painful situation that you cannot change, the past event itself, other people's choices, time that has already passed. On the right side, write everything you can still influence, starting right now. Your next action, your daily habits, who you spend time with, what you choose to focus on. Once this list exists in front of you, in your own handwriting, something shifts. The left side stops looking like an enemy you need to defeat and starts looking like simple, unchangeable fact. The way weather is fact. The way gravity is fact. You stop wasting breath arguing with gravity. You start climbing. Real-world application makes this concrete. Consider someone who just went through a painful divorce. Fighting reality looks like spending months replaying arguments, imagining different outcomes, checking their former partner's social media, and telling the same story of injustice to anyone who will listen. Accepting reality looks different. It looks like acknowledging the marriage ended, feeling the grief fully for a defined period, then asking what can be controlled now. Can they rebuild a daily routine? Can they reconnect with friends they lost touch with during the marriage? Can they use the newfound time to pursue something they always wanted to try? The marriage is over either way. The only question is whether the person spends the next 2 years drowning in a past that cannot be edited, or building a future that is entirely theirs to write. Consider someone who lost a parent unexpectedly. Fighting reality sounds like, "This isn't fair, they were too young, I wasn't ready." All true statements, and all statements that keep a person locked in a loop that changes nothing. Accepting reality does not mean the grief disappears, or that the loss stops mattering. It means eventually reaching a point where the person asks, "How do I honor this person through how I live now? Do I call my other loved ones more often? Do I take my own health more seriously because I saw how quickly life can end? Do I finally pursue the thing my parent always encouraged me to do?" Acceptance transforms grief from a prison into a teacher. Consider the person facing a serious illness. Fighting reality means spending every appointment angry at doctors, refusing to research treatment options, and telling themselves this cannot be happening even as test results confirm it repeatedly. Accepting reality means facing the diagnosis directly, gathering every piece of information available, following medical guidance, and asking what quality of life looks like starting today, not starting after some imaginary reversal of fate. Patients who accept their diagnosis and actively engage with treatment consistently report better mental health outcomes than those who remain in denial, even when the physical prognosis is identical. Acceptance is not passive, it is the doorway to active, intelligent response. One more tool worth carrying with you. When pain strikes, ask yourself this question: a year from now, will I be glad I spent today fighting what already happened, or building what comes next? This question cuts through emotional fog faster than almost anything else. It forces your mind out of the immediate sting and into a wider view of your own life. Strong people are not people who feel less pain than everyone else. They are people who ask this question sooner and answer it more honestly than most. Acceptance also requires you to release the fantasy of a different past. So many people carry around an invisible alternate life in their heads, the version where the job never got lost, the relationship never ended, the diagnosis never came. That alternate life does not exist. It never will. Every minute spent mourning a life that was never actually yours to live is a minute stolen from the life you are actually living right now. Letting go of that fantasy is not weakness. It is one of the bravest things a person can do, because it means facing your actual life exactly as it stands, without the comfort of pretending something else was possible. None of this happens overnight, and you should not expect it to. Acceptance is a practice, not a single decision you make once and then never think about again. Some days you will slip back into arguing with what happened. That is normal. That is human. The goal is not perfection. The goal is to notice when you are fighting reality and to gently, consistently redirect yourself back toward acceptance and action. Each time you do this, it gets a little easier. Each time you do this, you build a kind of muscle that most people never develop, because most people never try. Your pain is real. Nobody is asking you to pretend otherwise, but your pain does not have to become your permanent address. You can visit it, learn from it, even grieve deeply within it, and then you can leave it behind and walk toward the life still waiting for you to build it. The people who handle the worst situations with strength are not made of some rare material the rest of us lack. They simply stopped fighting what already happened, faster than most people do, and started using every remaining ounce of energy on what still lies ahead. That choice is available to you, starting the moment you close this chapter and return to your own life. Reality already happened. Your response to it has not been written yet. Write it well. Chapter 2. Rebuild your confidence after losing everything you trusted. Trust is a strange kind of currency. You spend years building it, coin by coin, deposit by deposit, and then one event, one betrayal, one collapse, can empty the entire account overnight. Maybe it was a business partner who disappeared with the money. Maybe it was a spouse who broke a promise you thought was unbreakable. Maybe it was your own body or your own judgment, failing you in a moment you needed it most. Whatever the cause, the result feels the same. You look in the mirror and no longer recognize the person staring back. The confidence that used to come naturally now feels like a costume that no longer fits. This chapter is about that exact moment, the moment after everything you trusted has fallen apart, and what you do next determines the entire shape of the years that follow. Confidence is often misunderstood. People think of it as a fixed trait, something you either have or don't, like eye color or height. That is false. Confidence is not a trait. Confidence is evidence. It is built the same way a bridge is built, plank by plank, tested under weight, reinforced through use. When your trust collapses, whether in another person, in an institution, or in yourself, what actually breaks is the bridge, not your capacity to build one. This distinction matters more than almost anything else in this chapter, because it changes the entire question you ask yourself. Instead of asking, "Why am I broken?" you start asking, "How do I build again?" Let's talk honestly about what losing trust actually feels like, because pretending it's simple does nobody any favors. There is a specific kind of exhaustion that comes from being betrayed or let down at the deepest level. Your body carries it, your sleep changes, your appetite shifts, you start scanning every new person or situation for the same warning signs you missed the last time, and this hypervigilance drains you in ways that are hard to explain to someone who hasn't lived through it. On top of the exhaustion sits shame, a quiet voice asking how you could have been so foolish, so blind, so trusting. That voice is loud in the beginning. It will try to convince you that your ability to trust was the flaw, that the solution is to never trust anything or anyone again. This is where most people get stuck for years, sometimes for the rest of their lives, and it is exactly the trap you need to avoid. Refusing to ever trust again is not strength. It is a smaller kind of defeat, dressed up to look like protection. A person who builds walls around themselves after betrayal has not overcome what happened to them. They have simply let the person or event who hurt them win a second time, this time by shrinking their entire future. Real strength is not the absence of future vulnerability. Real strength is learning to trust again, wisely, deliberately, with your eyes open instead of closed. So where do you actually begin, standing in the wreckage of what used to be your confidence? Begin with the smallest possible promise you can make to yourself, and then keep it. Not a grand resolution, not a declaration that you will rebuild your entire life by next month. Something small enough that failure is almost impossible. Tell yourself you will make your bed every morning this week. Tell yourself you will drink a full glass of water before checking your phone. Tell yourself you will walk outside for 10 minutes each day. These promises sound almost insignificant compared to the scale of what you lost, and that is exactly the point. Confidence rebuilds through proof, and proof requires evidence you can actually generate. You cannot manufacture evidence for a promise too large to keep, but you can manufacture it for one small enough to complete today. Each kept promise becomes a single plank on the new bridge. String enough of these together, and within weeks you will notice something shifting. You will start trusting your own word again because you have watched yourself keep it, repeatedly, without exception. Next, separate the specific betrayal from your entire identity. This step sounds simple, but it is one of the hardest mental shifts a person can make. When someone you trusted deeply hurts you, or when a plan you trusted deeply collapses, your mind tries to generalize the lesson far beyond where it actually belongs. One dishonest business partner becomes, "I cannot trust anyone in business." One failed marriage becomes, "I am unlovable," or "I always choose wrong." One financial collapse becomes, "I am bad with money," or "I am destined to struggle." None of these generalized conclusions are true, and all of them will quietly sabotage your future if you let them settle in unchallenged. Take out a piece of paper and write down the actual, specific lesson from what happened, separate from any conclusion about your worth. Maybe the actual lesson is, I need to verify financial claims independently before investing. Maybe it's, I need to pay closer attention to how someone treats people who can do nothing for them. These are useful, specific, actionable lessons. They are entirely different from broad statements about your value as a person, and confusing the two is what keeps people frozen for years. Physical action matters here more than people expect. When trust collapses, the nervous system often gets stuck in a state of alertness that mental effort alone struggles to resolve. Movement helps discharge this stored tension in a way that thinking cannot. This does not require an elaborate fitness routine. A daily walk, some stretching, even simply standing up and physically shaking out your arms and shoulders when anxious thoughts hit. All of this signals to your body that the danger has passed and it is safe to stand tall again. It lives in posture, in breath, in the way you physically carry yourself through a room. Pay attention to how you are standing right now as you consider everything you've lost. Chances are your shoulders are rounded forward. Your chest is caved slightly inward, protecting something vulnerable. Roll your shoulders back. Lift your chin a few degrees. This feels almost too simple to matter, but the body leads the mind more often than we like to admit, and acting confident, physically, in small ways, genuinely accelerates the return of confidence internally. Surround yourself deliberately with evidence of your own competence. After a major loss of trust, memory becomes selective and cruel. You remember every mistake in vivid detail while forgetting years of things you did well. Actively counter this by writing a list of moments when your judgment, your work, or your effort produced something good. Not humble bragging for an audience, just an honest, private record for yourself. Include small things: a project you finished on time, a friend you helped through a hard year, a skill you taught yourself from nothing. This list becomes ammunition against the shame voice, because that voice thrives on selective memory, and a written record is much harder to argue with than a vague feeling. Be careful, deliberately careful, about who you allow close to you during this rebuilding period. This is not about becoming paranoid or suspicious of everyone. It is about recognizing that you are in a vulnerable stage of reconstruction, similar to a bone healing after a fracture. You would not stress test a healing bone with the same force you'd apply to one fully mended. Give yourself the same grace. Choose relationships and environments during this time that reinforce steady, honest patterns, and distance yourself, even temporarily, from anything that mirrors the chaos you just escaped. Real-world application makes all of this concrete. Consider someone whose business partner drained the company accounts and vanished. Rebuilding confidence does not mean forcing themselves back into a new partnership immediately, hoping to prove something to themselves or others. It means starting with solo work they can fully control, tracking every dollar personally, verifying every claim before acting on it, and slowly, methodically working back toward collaboration with new safeguards in place, built from the specific lesson learned rather than blanket fear. Consider someone whose spouse had a long affair, shattering years of assumed loyalty. Rebuilding confidence does not mean swearing off relationships forever, nor does it mean rushing into a new one to prove they're still desirable. It means learning to trust their own perception again first, noticing that their instincts were not entirely wrong, that warning signs existed and were simply ignored out of hope, and rebuilding the internal voice that says, "I can read a situation accurately," before extending trust outward again to another person. Consider someone who trusted their own body completely until a serious health scare revealed vulnerability they never expected. Rebuilding confidence here means learning new information about their own limits, adjusting expectations without abandoning ambition entirely, and finding a new relationship with their body based on informed partnership rather than blind assumption or complete fear. In every one of these situations, notice the pattern. Confidence returns not through forgetting what happened and not through forcing yourself to feel something you don't yet feel. It returns through small, repeated, honest proof, stacked over time, until one day you realize you are standing differently, speaking differently, moving through the world with the quiet certainty of someone who has been tested and did not stay broken. You did not lose your worth when trust collapsed around you. You lost a version of the world you believed was solid ground. Solid ground can be rebuilt. It has been rebuilt by people before you who felt exactly as shattered as you feel right now, and it will be rebuilt by you, one small kept promise at a time, starting today. Chapter 3. Transform your fear into fuel for personal growth. Fear has a heartbeat. Stand still long enough in a moment of real fear, and you can feel it. That quick, shallow pulse in your chest, the tightness in your throat, the strange electric current running down your arms as if your body is preparing for something your mind hasn't fully understood yet. Most people spend their lives treating this feeling as an enemy, something to be avoided, numbed, or run from at any cost. But fear was never designed to be your enemy. Fear is raw, undirected energy, and the only real question is what you choose to do with it once it arrives. This chapter is about that choice, and about a truth that most people never discover until very late in life, if they discover it at all. The same trembling hands that hold you back from a difficult conversation can also carry you through it. The same racing heart that keeps you frozen at the edge of a decision can also be the exact fuel that pushes you forward, if you know how to redirect it. Fear and excitement live in the same body. Physiologically, they are almost identical. The heart rate increases, the palms sweat. The breath quickens, adrenaline floods the bloodstream. The only difference between fear and excitement is the story your mind attaches to these sensations. Tell yourself, "I am afraid," and your body braces to retreat. Tell yourself, "I am ready," and the exact same physical sensations become momentum instead of paralysis. This is not a trick of positive thinking. It is a documented pattern in how the human nervous system processes uncertainty, and it means you have far more control over fear than you were ever taught to believe. Understand first what fear is actually trying to do. It is not trying to ruin your life. It is trying to protect you, using a system built over an extremely long stretch of human history, a system designed for immediate physical danger, not for modern challenges like public speaking, career changes, or difficult conversations. Your nervous system cannot always tell the difference between a genuine threat to your survival and a threat to your comfort or your ego. This is why asking for a raise can trigger the same internal alarm as standing too close to a cliff edge, even though one situation carries actual physical danger and the other does not. Once you understand that fear is often responding to an outdated alarm system rather than real danger, you gain the ability to question it instead of obeying it automatically. Start by naming the fear specifically, out loud if possible, rather than letting it remain a vague cloud hovering over your day. Vague fear feels enormous and unmanageable. Specific fear becomes something you can actually work with. Instead of a general sense of dread about starting a new business, name it precisely. I am afraid I will run out of money within 6 months. Instead of a general anxiety about a difficult conversation, name it precisely. I am afraid they will reject what I have to say and think less of me. Specific fears can be examined, tested, and often disproven through honest reflection. Vague fears simply sit in your chest and grow heavier the longer they remain unnamed. Once named, ask a direct question that cuts through most fear almost instantly. What is the actual worst outcome, and could I survive it? Not, would it be uncomfortable, because almost everything meaningful in life is uncomfortable at some point. The real question is survival. Could you survive rejection? Could you survive financial setback? Could you survive public embarrassment? In nearly every case, when people force themselves to answer this question honestly, the answer is yes. You would survive it. You would feel pain, certainly, but pain is not the same as destruction. This single question strips fear of its exaggerated power and returns it to its proper size. From there, take the physical energy fear has already generated and immediately point it toward preparation instead of avoidance. This is the practical core of transforming fear into fuel. Your body is already activated. Your heart is already pounding. Your mind is already alert. Avoidance wastes all of this energy, letting it dissolve into restlessness or anxiety with nothing to show for it. Preparation captures that same energy and channels it into something productive. Afraid of an upcoming interview? Use the nervous energy to rehearse answers out loud. Research the company thoroughly and prepare questions of your own. Afraid of starting a difficult conversation? Use the energy to write down exactly what you want to say, word for word if necessary, so the fear has a direction to travel instead of an empty room to echo around in. Consider someone terrified of public speaking, a fear more common than almost any other. The instinct is to avoid every opportunity that requires standing in front of others, and this avoidance feels like relief in the short term. But each avoided opportunity reinforces the fear, teaching the nervous system that the only way to survive is retreat. The alternative path looks different. It means taking a small, low-stakes speaking opportunity, a brief update in a small meeting, a toast at a family gathering, and treating the racing heart beforehand not as a stop sign but as proof that the moment matters. Preparation absorbs the nervous energy. Practicing the opening lines 20 times in the shower, rehearsing in front of a mirror, timing the delivery, all of this gives fear somewhere productive to go. By the third or fourth attempt, most people notice the fear has not disappeared entirely, but it has shifted from paralysis into something closer to focus. Consider someone afraid to leave a stable but unfulfilling job to pursue work that actually matters to them. The fear here often disguises itself as practicality, as responsibility, as maturity. But underneath the reasonable-sounding language often sits simple fear of the unknown. Transforming this fear into fuel means using it to build a real, detailed plan rather than either ignoring the fear and impulsively quitting, or obeying the fear and staying frozen for another decade. It means calculating actual numbers, actual timelines, actual backup options, and using the nervous energy fear provides to research relentlessly instead of simply worrying relentlessly. The fear does not vanish during this process. It becomes the engine behind the research, behind the late nights spent building a plan, behind the discipline required to save money and prepare an exit strategy. Consider someone afraid of confronting a family member about years of hurtful behavior. This particular fear often runs deepest because it involves relationships woven into someone's earliest sense of identity. The instinct is to swallow the feelings indefinitely, protecting a fragile peace at the cost of personal well-being. Transforming this fear into fuel does not mean recklessly exploding with years of pent-up frustration. It means writing out exactly what needs to be said, practicing the delivery calmly, choosing a setting and time deliberately, and using the fear's intensity as evidence of how much this relationship genuinely matters, rather than evidence that the conversation should be avoided forever. Notice something consistent across every example. The fear is never eliminated before action is taken. This is the biggest misconception people carry, the belief that confidence must arrive first before courage becomes possible. In reality, the order runs the opposite direction almost every time. Action comes first, while the fear is still present, still loud, still physically uncomfortable. Confidence is the result that follows action, not the requirement that precedes it. Waiting to feel fearless before acting means waiting forever, because fear rarely announces its own departure in advance. Build a habit of asking, each time fear arises, what is this fear trying to protect me from, and is that protection still necessary? Sometimes the answer reveals genuine caution worth honoring, a signal that more preparation is needed before moving forward. Other times the answer reveals an outdated alarm, triggered by an old wound or an old story that no longer reflects your actual capability. Learning to tell these two types of fear apart, real caution versus outdated alarm, is one of the most valuable skills a person can develop, and it only comes through repeated practice, through facing fear again and again until the pattern becomes clear. Track your fears over time, in writing if possible. Keep a simple record of moments you felt afraid, what you chose to do despite that fear, and what actually happened afterward. Months later, reading back through this record becomes powerful evidence against fear's usual predictions. You will notice again and again that the catastrophic outcomes fear promised rarely arrived, and that the moments you pushed through, despite the trembling hands and the racing heart, became turning points you now look back on with pride rather than regret. Fear will never fully disappear from your life, and chasing a fear-free existence is chasing something that does not exist for any human being, no matter how accomplished or strong they appear from the outside. What changes, for those who commit to this practice, is the relationship with fear itself. It stops being a wall and starts becoming a signal, a form of energy arriving right on time, exactly when something meaningful is on the other side of it. The next time your heart starts pounding before something difficult, resist the urge to interpret that pounding as danger. Interpret it instead as your body gathering fuel, preparing you for exactly the growth you have been asking for. Chapter 4. Master your emotions before they control your decisions. There is a gap that exists in every human mind, a small space between the moment something happens and the moment you respond to it. Most people never notice this gap exists at all. They live as though stimulus and response are fused together, as though anger must automatically produce a shouted word, as though hurt must automatically produce a cruel reply, as though panic must automatically produce a rash decision. But that gap is real, and inside it lives more power than almost anything else you will ever discover about yourself. The width of that gap, how long you can hold it open before reacting, determines almost everything about the quality of your decisions, your relationships, and ultimately your life. Emotions themselves are not the problem. This needs to be said clearly, because so much advice about emotional control quietly implies that feeling deeply is a weakness, that the goal is to become numb or detached. That is not mastery. That is suppression, and suppression tends to backfire in ways that create far more damage than the original emotion ever could. Anger, sadness, fear, jealousy, all of these serve real purposes. They carry information. Anger often signals a boundary has been crossed. Sadness often signals something meaningful has been lost. Fear often signals genuine risk worth considering. The goal is never to eliminate these signals. The goal is to receive the information they carry without letting them seize the steering wheel and drive your decisions off a cliff. Consider how many of the worst decisions in human history, and in your own personal history if you're honest with yourself, were made in the 2 or 3 minutes following an emotional spike. The email sent in fury that could never be unsent. The relationship ended in a moment of hurt pride that could never be fully repaired. The resignation submitted in frustration that closed a door permanently. The purchase made in a wave of anxiety that drained savings meant for something more important. In almost every case, if the person had simply waited, even just an hour, even just overnight, the decision would have looked completely different. This is not a coincidence. It is a pattern so consistent that entire fields of psychology have been built around studying it, and the pattern points to one conclusion. Emotions are most dangerous not when you feel them, but when you act on them at their peak intensity, before they've had any chance to settle. Here is a practical tool worth using starting today. When a strong emotion hits, whether it's rage, panic, heartbreak, or overwhelming excitement, commit to a mandatory waiting period before any major decision or communication tied to that emotion. 90 seconds is often enough for the initial biochemical surge of an emotion to begin softening its grip, according to research on how emotional responses move through the body. For smaller reactions, 90 seconds might be enough. For larger ones, give yourself an hour. For genuinely life-altering decisions, give yourself a full day, or longer if the situation allows it. This is not about avoiding the emotion. You still feel every bit of it. You simply refuse to let the emotion write your next sentence, send your next message, or sign your next decision while it's still at full volume. Physical distance helps enormously here. And this is a tool people underestimate. When emotion floods your system, your body is often the fastest way back to clarity, faster than trying to think your way out. Step outside, walk around the block. Splash cold water on your face. Physically remove yourself from the room, the screen, or the person who triggered the reaction. This is not running away from the problem. It is creating literal, physical space that mirrors the mental gap you're trying to widen. A conversation continued in the heat of anger rarely improves with more words thrown into it. A conversation paused and resumed an hour later, after both people have physically stepped back, has a genuine chance of resolution instead of escalation. Naming the emotion precisely, the moment you notice it rising, interrupts its automatic momentum in a way that silently feeling it does not. There is real value in simply saying, even quietly to yourself, "I am feeling intense anger right now," or "This is anxiety, not danger." The simple act of labeling an emotion activates a different part of the brain than the part driving the raw reaction, shifting some of the intensity from pure feeling into observation. You move, even slightly, from being consumed by the emotion to standing a step outside of it, watching it happen. This shift, small as it sounds, is often the difference between a reaction and a response. Ask yourself, in that gap you've created, a single clarifying question. What will this decision look like to me in 1 year? Rage wants you to send the message right now. Ask the 1-year question, and often the urgency dissolves, revealing that the relationship, the job, or the friendship matters more than the temporary satisfaction of a sharp reply. Fear wants you to abandon the opportunity immediately. Ask the 1-year question, and sometimes you realize the fear is protecting a comfort zone rather than protecting you from genuine harm. This single question, asked honestly and consistently, filters out an enormous percentage of decisions that would otherwise be driven by temporary emotional weather rather than lasting judgment. Consider someone who receives harsh, unfair criticism from a boss in front of colleagues. The immediate emotional pull is toward defense, toward a sharp retort, toward proving the boss wrong on the spot, or toward silently seething and typing out a resignation letter that same night. Someone practicing emotional mastery instead notices the heat rising, breathes, and says only what's necessary to close the moment respectfully. Later, once the emotional charge has faded, they revisit the situation with a clear head, deciding calmly whether the criticism holds any truth worth addressing, whether a private conversation with the boss is warranted, or whether this is simply a pattern worth documenting for future reference. The outcome from this delayed, deliberate response is almost always better than anything produced in the heat of the original moment. Consider someone who feels a surge of jealousy watching a friend's success unfold on social media. The immediate pull might be toward a passive-aggressive comment, toward quietly distancing from the friendship, toward a spiral of self-criticism that ruins the rest of the evening. Someone practicing emotional mastery notices the jealousy, names it honestly rather than pretending it isn't there, and asks what the feeling is actually pointing toward. Often jealousy reveals a genuine desire the person has been neglecting in their own life. Rather than acting on the emotion by attacking the friend or spiraling into comparison, they redirect the energy into examining their own goals, turning a corrosive feeling into useful information about what they actually want for themselves. Consider someone facing a financial emergency, the kind of situation that triggers pure panic, the urge to make any decision immediately just to make the fear stop. Panic says sell everything, borrow from anyone, agree to any terms just to relieve the pressure right now. Emotional mastery means acknowledging the panic fully, perhaps even writing it out on paper to get it out of the body, and then forcing a pause before any financial decision is finalized. Sleeping on it, consulting someone with a clearer head, running the actual numbers rather than the panicked estimate racing through the mind, these steps almost always produce a wiser decision than whatever the first panicked impulse suggested. Notice that in every one of these situations, the emotion was never denied or pushed away. It was felt fully, named honestly, and then separated from the immediate decision that followed it. This separation is the entire skill. It is not natural for most people, and it will not feel natural the first several times you attempt it. The pull toward immediate reaction is strong, wired deeply into how humans have operated for a very long stretch of history. But like any skill, the gap between stimulus and response widens with deliberate practice. Each time you successfully pause before reacting, the pause becomes slightly easier to access the next time. Build a simple habit around this. At the end of each day, briefly review any moments where a strong emotion arose. Ask yourself honestly whether you responded from that gap of awareness or whether the emotion drove the decision directly. No judgment is needed here, only honest observation. Over weeks and months, this daily review sharpens your ability to catch the emotional spike earlier and earlier in the moment, until eventually you notice the rising heat before it fully takes hold, rather than after the damage is already done. The people who move through the worst situations in life without leaving a trail of wreckage behind them are not people who feel less. Often they feel more deeply than most, more attuned to hurt, more sensitive to injustice, more moved by loss. What separates them is not the depth of their feeling, but the space they've trained themselves to hold between that feeling and their next action. That space is available to you as well. It exists in every single moment, waiting to be used, and every time you choose to pause inside it, rather than react blindly through it, you take one more step toward becoming someone whose decisions are shaped by wisdom, rather than whatever emotion happened to be loudest that day. Chapter 5. Create daily habits that strengthen your mental resilience. Nobody rises to meet a crisis using strength they haven't already built. This is one of the most misunderstood truths about resilience. People imagine that when disaster strikes, they will somehow discover a reservoir of inner strength they didn't know existed, that the moment will call something forward from nowhere. But that is not how the mind works, and it is not how muscle works either, physical or mental. You do not find strength in the crisis. You find whatever strength you already built, quietly, in the ordinary days that came before it. The daily habits you practice when nothing is wrong are the exact habits that determine how you perform when everything goes wrong. This is why the smallest, most unglamorous routines matter so much more than people give them credit for. Nobody writes songs about making their bed. Nobody films dramatic movies about a consistent sleep schedule. And yet these quiet, repeated actions are the foundation beneath every dramatic story of someone surviving the unthinkable and coming out stronger. Resilience is not a personality trait some people are simply born with. It is a stockpile, built day by day, and either you have been filling that stockpile through your daily habits, or you have been draining it, and you will not know which one is true until the day you actually need it. Start with the body, because the body is the foundation everything else rests on, and this is not optional or secondary advice. When your body is depleted, your mind has almost nothing to work with during hard times. Sleep is the single most underrated resilience tool available to any human being, and yet it is the first thing most people sacrifice when life gets difficult, which is exactly backward. A brain running on insufficient sleep loses access to emotional regulation, clear judgment, and problem-solving ability almost immediately, sometimes within a single night of poor rest. Build a consistent sleep schedule now, while things are calm, going to bed and waking at roughly the same time each day, because this consistency trains your body's internal rhythm to function reliably. When hard times eventually arrive, and they will, a well-regulated sleep pattern becomes one of your strongest defenses against falling apart. Movement works the same way. You do not need an elaborate fitness routine or hours in a gym to build this particular kind of resilience. You need consistency. 20 minutes of walking daily, done without fail, teaches your nervous system something valuable that no amount of occasional intense exercise can replicate. It teaches your body that stress can be moved through rather than only endured while sitting still. People who move their bodies daily process difficult emotions with noticeably more ease than people who remain sedentary, because physical movement gives stress hormones somewhere to go, rather than allowing them to accumulate untouched in the system. Choose movement you can sustain for years, not weeks, because the resilience benefit comes entirely from consistency rather than intensity. Beyond the body, build a daily practice of controlled discomfort. This sounds strange at first, but it is one of the most powerful resilience habits available. Seek out small, safe, voluntary discomforts on a regular basis: a cold shower each morning, a fasting window before breakfast, a hard workout you'd rather skip, a difficult conversation you'd rather avoid. None of these need to be extreme. The purpose is not suffering for its own sake. The purpose is teaching your mind, repeatedly, in low-stakes situations, that discomfort is survivable and temporary. People who never voluntarily practice discomfort tend to panic disproportionately when involuntary discomfort eventually arrives, because their mind has no prior evidence that hard things can be endured. People who practice small discomforts daily build an internal library of proof, evidence they can call upon later that says, clearly and specifically, "I have done hard things before, and I survived them." Journaling deserves a place in this daily practice, not as a vague suggestion, but as a specific tool with a specific function. Each evening, write down 3 things. First, one difficult moment from the day and how you handled it. Second, one thing you are grateful for, no matter how small. Third, one thing you are looking forward to tomorrow. This 3-part structure trains your mind to notice patterns in how you respond to difficulty, builds a habit of recognizing good even in ordinary days, and creates forward momentum by keeping your attention partly oriented toward what's ahead, rather than only what's behind. Over months, this simple evening practice creates a written record you can return to during genuinely hard seasons, proof in your own handwriting that you have navigated difficulty before and come through it. Guard your mornings carefully, because how you begin the day sets the tone your mind carries into everything that follows. Many people wake up and immediately reach for their phone, flooding their mind within seconds with other people's opinions, other people's crises, other people's curated highlight reels. This is not a neutral choice. It shapes your entire emotional starting point before you've had a single private moment to think your own thoughts. Build a morning routine that belongs entirely to you before the outside world gets access to your attention. Even 10 minutes of quiet, whether spent in stillness, stretching, reading, or simply sitting with a cup of coffee in silence, gives your mind a stable foundation before the demands of the day begin pulling it in every direction. Practice regularly reviewing what has actually gone well in your life, not as empty positivity, but as accurate record-keeping. The human mind has a strong natural bias toward remembering threats and failures far more vividly than successes and good fortune, a bias that once helped humans survive genuine physical dangers, but now mostly just distorts our sense of our own capability. Counteract this bias deliberately. Once a week, write down specific challenges you've overcome in the past, situations that once felt impossible and are now simply part of your history. This is not about pretending life is easier than it is. It is about maintaining an accurate, complete record, rather than the distorted, threat-focused record your mind naturally defaults to. Build relationships into your daily resilience practice as well, because isolation is one of the fastest ways to weaken mental strength over time. This does not require large amounts of social time. It requires consistency and genuine connection. A daily check-in with one person who knows you well, a weekly meal with people who make you feel supported rather than drained. These small, consistent touches build a support structure that becomes essential during genuinely hard periods. People with strong daily connection habits recover from major setbacks noticeably faster than people who face difficulty in isolation, largely because they have practiced reaching out for support long before an emergency made it necessary. Consider someone who spends years building these small daily habits: consistent sleep, regular movement, small voluntary discomforts, honest journaling, protected mornings, weekly reflection on past strength, and daily human connection. Then, a serious setback arrives, a job loss, a health scare, a sudden loss. This person does not handle the setback because they suddenly discover hidden strength in the moment of crisis. They handle it because every single day for years, they were quietly making deposits into a resilience account they didn't fully realize they were building. When the withdrawal came due, the account had enough in it. Now consider someone who neglects these same habits, who sacrifices sleep constantly, avoids all discomfort, never reflects on past strength, and remains largely isolated from consistent support. When a setback of equal magnitude arrives, this person faces the exact same external circumstances, but with none of the internal reserves the first person built. The difference between these two outcomes was never about the severity of what happened to them. It was entirely about what was already in place, quietly, long before the crisis ever arrived. This is the honest truth about resilience that most people never hear clearly stated. You do not build it in the moment you need it. You build it in the boring, ordinary days when nothing dramatic is happening at all, when it would be easy to skip the walk, sleep in past your alarm, avoid the hard conversation, or scroll through your phone instead of writing in your journal. Every one of those small choices is either strengthening your resilience account or quietly depleting it. Start today, not because disaster is imminent, but because the habits that protect you during the worst moments of your life are being written right now, in this completely ordinary day, whether you notice it happening or not. Chapter 6. Release toxic people who drain your inner strength. You can identify a draining relationship the same way you identify a slow leak in a tire. Nothing happens all at once. There's no dramatic blowout, no single moment where everything goes flat. Instead, you just notice, over time, that you're tired more often than you should be, that you feel smaller after certain conversations than before them, that your energy seems to disappear into a specific person, the way air disappears through a puncture too small to see. This chapter is about learning to notice that leak, naming it honestly, and having the courage to patch it or walk away from the tire entirely. Let's be precise about what a toxic relationship actually is, because the word gets used loosely and loses its power when it does. A toxic relationship is not simply one where you disagree sometimes or where the other person has flaws, because every relationship involves friction and every human being carries flaws. A toxic relationship is one with a consistent pattern, repeated over time, where your well-being is treated as less important than the other person's comfort, where honesty is punished rather than welcomed, where your growth is quietly resented instead of celebrated, or where you find yourself constantly shrinking, apologizing, or performing a version of yourself that isn't real, just to keep the peace. The key word here is pattern. One bad day does not define a relationship. A consistent pattern, stretching across months or years, does. Many people struggle to release these relationships because of a specific kind of confusion between loyalty and self-destruction. They believe that leaving, or even distancing themselves, makes them a bad friend, a bad family member, a bad partner. This confusion runs deep, often planted early in life, and it needs to be addressed directly. Loyalty to another person was never meant to require the abandonment of yourself. A relationship that demands your constant self-erasure as the price of continued connection is not loyalty being tested. It is a trade that was never fair to begin with, and recognizing this difference is often the first real step toward freedom. Notice the specific signs your body and mind give you around draining people, because these signs are often more honest than your conscious thoughts, which can be clouded by history, guilt, or hope for change. Do you feel a slight tightening in your chest before answering their call? Do you find yourself mentally rehearsing conversations with them, trying to preemptively manage their reaction? Do you feel exhausted after time with them, even when nothing dramatic happened during the interaction itself? Do you find yourself constantly explaining away their behavior to other people, working harder to defend them than they ever work to treat you well? These signals are data. They deserve to be trusted rather than explained away. There is a specific and important distinction worth making here between someone going through a hard season and someone who is chronically, consistently draining as a way of operating in the world. Everyone experiences difficult periods where they need more support, more patience, more grace than usual, and showing up for people during genuine hardship is one of the most meaningful things you can do as a human being. The difference lies in direction and duration. A person moving through a hard season, even a long one, is still oriented toward eventually getting better, still capable of gratitude, still occasionally able to show up for you in return when they're able. A chronically draining person shows no such direction. The crisis never ends. The need never lessens. The gratitude, if it exists at all, never balances against what's being taken. Learning to distinguish between these two patterns prevents you from either abandoning someone who genuinely needs temporary support or staying indefinitely tied to someone who will never change the pattern, regardless of how much time or grace you offer. Releasing a toxic relationship rarely requires a dramatic confrontation, and waiting for the perfect moment to deliver a powerful final speech often becomes an excuse to delay action indefinitely. Sometimes release looks like a direct conversation, clearly stating what has changed and why. Often, though, it looks quieter than that. It looks like slowly reducing contact, no longer initiating plans, keeping conversations shorter and less personal, and allowing the relationship to fade in intensity rather than ending with a single explosive event. Both approaches are valid. The method matters far less than the outcome, which is protecting your own capacity to function and grow. Guilt will almost certainly arrive during this process, and expecting it in advance makes it far easier to move through. Guilt shows up not because you're doing something wrong, but because you're breaking a pattern that has existed for a long time, and any broken pattern, even an unhealthy one, creates internal friction as it dissolves. Sit with this guilt without letting it reverse your decision. Ask yourself directly whether the guilt is pointing toward genuine wrongdoing on your part, or whether it's simply the discomfort of unfamiliar territory, the strange quiet that follows removing a weight you'd carried so long you'd forgotten it was optional. Practical steps make this process far less overwhelming than it feels in theory. Start by making a private, honest list of the people who consistently drain your energy versus the people who consistently restore it. Be specific rather than vague. Write actual names. Notice any patterns. Perhaps every person on the draining list shares a similar behavior. Constant criticism, constant need, constant negativity, constant comparison. Once the pattern is visible on paper, it becomes much harder to explain away in your own mind. Next, choose one relationship from that list, ideally not the most difficult one, to begin with. Practice setting a small boundary first, before attempting a larger release. Perhaps this means declining an invitation you'd normally accept out of obligation. Perhaps it means ending a phone call after a reasonable amount of time, instead of allowing it to stretch into hours of one-sided complaint. Notice how you feel afterward. Most people expect disaster and instead find relief, along with a small but real increase in their sense of control over their own life. Consider someone with a friend who only reaches out during personal crises, disappearing entirely during good times, never once asking how the other person is actually doing. Over years, this pattern trains the person on the receiving end to feel valued only for their usefulness during emergencies, never for their presence otherwise. Releasing this relationship might look like gently reducing how quickly and thoroughly they respond to crisis calls, redirecting that same energy toward friendships that show interest during ordinary days as well as hard ones. The friendship may fade naturally as the imbalance becomes visible to both parties, without requiring a single confrontational conversation. Consider someone in a family dynamic where a relative consistently criticizes their choices, their appearance, or their life decisions under the guise of honest concern. Releasing this relationship does not necessarily mean cutting off family entirely, which isn't always possible or desired. It might mean setting a clear boundary around specific topics that are no longer open for discussion, changing the subject firmly when crossed, and limiting the length or frequency of interactions to protect against the cumulative damage of repeated criticism. Consider someone in a romantic relationship where their partner consistently competes with their success instead of celebrating it, growing distant or irritable every time something good happens to the other person. This pattern, subtle and easy to explain away individually, becomes unmistakable when viewed as a whole across many months. Releasing this relationship, whether through a direct conversation about the pattern or through eventually ending the relationship entirely, protects something essential: the freedom to grow and succeed without fear of punishment from the person closest to you. In every one of these situations, the common thread is protecting your capacity to remain strong, stable, and whole. Every person you keep close to you either adds to your resilience or quietly withdraws from it, and pretending this isn't happening does not make it stop happening. It only delays the moment you finally address it, usually until the damage has grown far larger than it needed to become. This chapter is not an invitation to become cold, suspicious, or unwilling to invest deeply in others. Quite the opposite. Releasing draining relationships creates the space, energy, and emotional capacity required to invest more fully in the relationships that actually deserve it, the ones where support flows in both directions, where honesty is welcomed rather than punished, where your growth is celebrated rather than resented. Strength was never meant to be spent defending relationships that require your constant depletion as the cost of their continuation. Redirect that strength toward the people and pursuits that give as much as they take, and watch how much more capacity you have left over for the life you're actually trying to build. Chapter 7. Turn failure into your greatest teacher and guide. Every failure carries a message sealed inside it, waiting to be opened. Most people never open that message. They feel the sting of failing, they let the shame wash over them, and then they slam the door shut on the entire experience as quickly as possible, filing it away under things too painful to examine closely. This is the single greatest waste of human experience there is, because that sealed message almost always contains exactly the information you need to succeed the next time. Failure is not the opposite of progress. Failure is one of the most efficient teachers available to any human being, and the only question is whether you're willing to sit in class long enough to learn the lesson it's offering. There is a fundamental difference between someone who fails once and quits, and someone who fails repeatedly and eventually succeeds, and that difference has almost nothing to do with talent, luck, or natural ability. It has everything to do with what each person does in the hours and days immediately following the failure. One person treats the failure as evidence of who they are, absorbing it into their identity, concluding that they are simply not capable, not smart enough, not meant for whatever they attempted. The other person treats the failure as evidence about a specific approach, a specific decision, a specific piece of information they didn't have before, entirely separate from their worth or capability as a human being. This second person can fail 100 times and remain undamaged, because each failure is filed as data rather than as verdict. This distinction between failure as identity and failure as information deserves careful attention because it changes literally everything about how you move forward after something goes wrong. When a failure becomes identity, it says, "I failed, therefore I am a failure." This single sentence, repeated enough times after enough setbacks, becomes a story a person tells about themselves for the rest of their life, a story that quietly prevents them from ever attempting anything difficult again, because attempting difficult things risks confirming the story further. When a failure becomes information instead, it says, "This specific approach did not work, given these specific conditions, and here is what I now know that I didn't know before." This sentence contains no verdict about your worth. It simply contains a fact, useful and specific, ready to be applied toward a better attempt. Practically speaking, how do you actually extract the lesson from a failure instead of simply drowning in the emotional pain of it? Start with a structured review, done honestly and without excessive self-punishment. ideally once the initial emotional sting has softened enough that you can think somewhat clearly. Ask 4 specific questions. What exactly did I expect to happen? What actually happened instead? What specific factor caused the difference between those 2 outcomes? What will I do differently next time, given what I now know? This 4-question structure forces analysis instead of spiraling, and it works for failures of every size, from a minor mistake in a work presentation to a business that collapsed after years of effort. Write these answers down, rather than simply thinking them through in your head. There is something about the physical act of writing that clarifies thought in ways that internal rumination cannot match. A failure kept entirely in your head tends to circle endlessly, growing larger and more distorted each time it loops back around, picking up extra shame and extra catastrophic thinking with each pass. A failure written down on paper becomes contained, specific, and finite. It stops being an ever-expanding cloud of bad feeling and becomes a page you can close and return to later with a clearer head. Separate the outcome from the effort, because these 2 things are not the same, and conflating them creates enormous unnecessary suffering. You can give genuine, full effort towards something and still fail, because outcomes depend on countless factors outside your control: timing, market conditions, other people's decisions, sheer chance. Evaluating yourself purely on outcome, ignoring the quality of effort and preparation you actually brought, creates a distorted picture that either inflates your ego during lucky wins or crushes your confidence during unlucky losses, neither of which reflects the truth about your actual capability. Ask honestly whether you prepared well, whether you executed with genuine effort, and separately, whether the outcome matched what you hoped for. Sometimes the honest answer is that your effort was strong and the outcome was simply unlucky, a completely different lesson than discovering your effort itself needs improvement. Consider someone who launches a small business that fails within its first year, watching savings disappear along with months of intense effort. Treating this as identity sounds like, "I am not cut out for business, I should never try again." Treating this as information looks entirely different. It means reviewing the specific numbers, discovering perhaps that pricing was set too low to cover real costs, or that marketing reached the wrong audience entirely, or that the original idea addressed a problem too few people actually cared enough about to pay for. Each of these specific lessons becomes valuable input for a second attempt, whether in the same industry or a different one entirely. Almost every successful entrepreneur carries a graveyard of earlier failed attempts behind them, each one contributing specific, hard-won knowledge that eventually shaped their eventual success. Consider someone who fails an important exam or certification despite months of preparation. Treating this as identity sounds like, "I am simply not smart enough for this field." Treating this as information means examining the actual gaps revealed by the failure. Perhaps certain topics were understudied. Perhaps the study method itself, passive reading rather than active practice testing, simply wasn't effective for how this particular person's mind retains information. Perhaps test anxiety played a larger role than actual knowledge gaps, revealing a need to practice performing under pressure rather than only studying content. Each of these specific findings creates a clear, actionable path toward a stronger second attempt, entirely separate from any judgment about overall intelligence or worth. Consider someone whose long-term relationship ends, leaving them wondering what they did wrong and whether they're simply incapable of maintaining a lasting partnership. Treating this as identity sounds like, "I always ruin relationships, something is fundamentally wrong with me." Treating this as information requires the harder, more honest work of examining actual patterns, without excessive self-blame or excessive blame of the other person either. Perhaps communication broke down repeatedly around specific topics that were never addressed directly. Perhaps certain needs went unexpressed for years until resentment built silently underneath the surface. Perhaps compatibility issues existed from the start that neither person wanted to acknowledge honestly. These specific lessons, uncomfortable as they are to face, become genuinely useful guidance for future relationships, rather than a vague, crushing sense of permanent personal failure. Notice, across every one of these examples, that turning failure into a teacher requires a specific kind of courage. The courage to look directly at what went wrong without flinching away and without collapsing into shame. Most people do one or the other. They either refuse to look at the failure honestly at all, protecting their ego by blaming outside circumstances entirely, learning nothing useful in the process, or they look at the failure so harshly, with such merciless self-criticism, that the shame becomes unbearable, and they simply quit, rather than face something so painful again. The narrow path between these two extremes, honest examination without excessive self-punishment, is exactly where the real learning happens, and walking that path consistently is what separates people who eventually succeed from people who give up after the first serious setback. Build a specific practice around this. After any significant failure, once you've allowed yourself time to genuinely feel the disappointment, sit down and complete the 4-question review in writing. Then, deliberately, write one sentence describing the specific skill, knowledge, or insight this failure gave you that you did not possess before. This final sentence matters enormously because it forces your mind to locate the gift hidden inside the disappointment, transforming the entire experience from pure loss into a trade, painful as it was, that left you with something valuable in return. Keep a written record of these lessons over time, a simple document or journal dedicated entirely to failures and what they taught you. Months or years later, this record becomes remarkable to revisit. Patterns emerge that weren't visible in any single failure alone. You begin to see your own growth mapped out clearly, failure by failure, lesson by lesson, each one a stepping stone rather than a dead end. This record also becomes a powerful antidote to fear when facing new challenges, because it provides concrete proof that failure, even repeated failure, did not destroy you in the past and will not destroy you now. The people who accomplish extraordinary things across every field, business, art, science, relationships, athletics, all share this same relationship with failure, whether they've articulated it in these exact terms or not. They fail often, sometimes spectacularly, and they extract every possible lesson from each failure before moving forward again, stronger and better informed than before. Failure was never meant to be the end of your story. It was always meant to be one of your most reliable teachers, standing ready to hand you exactly the lesson you need, if only you're willing to sit still long enough and honest enough to actually receive it. Chapter 8. Build unshakable discipline when motivation completely disappears. Motivation is a guest who visits occasionally and leaves without warning. It shows up on the first day of January, full of energy, promising you it will stay all year. It shows up after watching an inspiring video, after reading a powerful quote, after a conversation with someone who's achieved something you admire. And then, almost always within days, sometimes within hours, it packs its bags and disappears, leaving you standing exactly where you started, wondering what happened to that surge of energy you felt so certain would carry you through. If you have built your entire approach to self-improvement around waiting for motivation to show up before you take action, you have built your life on a foundation that was never designed to hold steady weight. Discipline is the foundation motivation was always meant to sit on top of, not the other way around. This distinction matters enormously, and most people never fully understand it. They believe successful, disciplined people simply feel motivated more often than everyone else, that something about their internal wiring produces a constant stream of enthusiasm that ordinary people lack. This is almost entirely false. People who accomplish difficult long-term goals feel unmotivated just as often as everyone else. The difference is not the presence of motivation. The difference is that they have built systems and habits that function completely independently of whether motivation shows up on any given day. They do the work whether they feel like it or not, and this single distinction, more than any other factor, separates people who achieve lasting change from people who start over every few months with a fresh burst of temporary enthusiasm. Understand first why motivation is such an unreliable partner. Motivation is largely an emotional state, and emotional states are inherently unstable, shaped by sleep, hormones, weather, stress, recent events, and countless other factors entirely outside your conscious control. Building your actions around an unstable foundation guarantees an unstable result. Discipline, by contrast, is not an emotional state at all. Discipline is a decision made once in advance that removes the need to redecide every single day based on how you happen to feel in that moment. This is the entire secret hiding in plain sight. Disciplined people are not constantly relying on willpower in each individual moment. They have already made the decision once, clearly and in advance, and now they simply follow through on a decision already made, regardless of the mood attached to any particular day. The single most powerful tool for building this kind of discipline is drastically lowering the size of your daily commitment until it becomes nearly impossible to skip. This sounds counterintuitive to people who believe bigger goals require bigger daily effort, but the opposite is often true in practice. A goal to exercise for 90 minutes daily sounds impressive, but it collapses the moment life gets busy or energy runs low, because the size of the commitment makes skipping feel almost reasonable on hard days. A goal to exercise for 5 minutes daily sounds almost too small to matter, and this is exactly why it survives the days when motivation is completely absent. 5 minutes requires no motivation at all, only the willingness to begin, and beginning is almost always the hardest part. Once you've started, 5 minutes frequently becomes 15 or 20 simply through momentum, but even on the days it doesn't, the habit itself survives intact, unbroken, ready to be built upon again tomorrow. Build your identity around the habit rather than around the outcome, because outcome-based motivation fades quickly, while identity-based commitment tends to last. Instead of telling yourself, "I am trying to write a book," tell yourself, "I am a writer," and writers write daily, regardless of how the words feel on any given day. Instead of telling yourself, "I am trying to get healthier," tell yourself, "I am someone who moves their body every day, no matter what." This shift from outcome to identity changes the internal conversation entirely. Skipping a daily habit no longer feels like simply missing a task on a list. It starts to feel like acting against who you actually are, and this creates a much stronger, more consistent pull toward follow-through than any external outcome ever could. Remove decision-making from the equation as much as possible, because every decision you have to make in the moment is another opportunity for motivation's absence to derail you. Decide the night before exactly what time you will wake up, exactly what you will wear to exercise, exactly what the very first task of your workday will be. When these decisions are already made in advance, during a calmer moment when your judgment is clearer, you remove the vulnerable window where low motivation gets a chance to talk you out of anything. The fewer decisions required in the actual moment of action, the more reliably that action gets completed, regardless of how you feel. Create an environment that makes the disciplined choice the easiest available option and makes the undisciplined choice slightly harder to reach. This principle, often overlooked, carries enormous practical power. If your goal is reading daily, keep the book on your pillow so you physically cannot get into bed without moving it. If your goal is avoiding excessive phone use, charge your phone in another room overnight, out of arm's reach when the alarm goes off. If your goal is consistent morning exercise, sleep in your workout clothes so getting dressed is no longer a barrier standing between you and starting. None of these environmental adjustments require motivation. They simply reduce the friction on the path you want to take and increase the friction on the path you're trying to avoid. Track your consistency visually, because seeing a growing record of completed days creates its own momentum, entirely separate from motivation. A simple calendar with an X marked on every day you complete your habit becomes surprisingly powerful over time. There is something in human psychology that resists breaking a visible chain. a real reluctance to be the one who ruins a streak that's taken weeks or months to build. This visual record becomes its own form of accountability, quiet but persistent, sitting on your wall or in your notebook, reminding you daily of what you're actually capable of sustaining. Consider someone determined to write a novel, starting each January with tremendous enthusiasm that consistently evaporates by February. Building unshakable discipline here does not mean waiting for a return of that initial excitement. It means committing to writing exactly 200 words daily, an amount small enough to complete even during the busiest, most uninspired days. Some days those 200 words turn into 2,000, carried forward by unexpected momentum. Other days the writer stops at exactly 200, tired and uninspired, but the habit remains unbroken, and unbroken habits, stacked day after day, eventually produce a finished manuscript, regardless of how motivated any individual day happened to feel. Consider someone rebuilding their physical health after years of neglect, starting programs repeatedly only to abandon each one within a few weeks once initial enthusiasm fades. Building unshakable discipline here means abandoning the search for the perfect program entirely and instead committing to something almost embarrassingly small, 10 push-ups every morning, without exception, regardless of sleep, mood, or schedule. This tiny, nearly automatic commitment survives the low motivation days that destroy more ambitious plans, and over months, this survivability, not initial intensity, is what actually produces lasting transformation. Consider someone trying to build a consistent meditation practice, starting with ambitious 30-minute sessions that quickly feel like a burden rather than a support, leading to eventual abandonment. Unshakable discipline here means shrinking the commitment down to 2 minutes daily, small enough that skipping feels almost silly. 2 minutes of consistent daily practice, sustained across a full year, produces far more genuine benefit than 30 minutes practiced sporadically for 2 weeks before quitting entirely from sheer overwhelm. Notice the pattern running through every one of these examples. Unshakable discipline is never built through occasional bursts of intense motivation. It is built through embarrassingly small, nearly unbreakable daily commitments, sustained consistently across long stretches of time, regardless of how any individual day happens to feel. The size of the daily action matters far less than most people assume. What matters is whether the action survives contact with a genuinely bad day, a day with no sleep, no energy, and absolutely zero motivation in sight. Expect motivation to disappear regularly and stop treating its absence as a signal that something has gone wrong. Motivation was never meant to be a constant companion. It arrives occasionally as a welcome bonus, an extra boost on days when it happens to show up, but it was never designed to be the engine your entire effort depends on. Build your systems, your environment, and your daily commitments to function reliably without it, and you will discover something remarkable waiting on the other side of this shift. The people who appear unshakably disciplined from the outside are not people who feel motivated more often than you do. They are simply people who stopped waiting for that feeling, built structures strong enough to carry them without it, and kept walking forward, one small unbreakable action at a time, through every single unmotivated day standing between where they started and where they eventually arrived. Chapter 9. Trust the process, even when results stay invisible. Bamboo trees follow a strange pattern that confuses anyone who plants them without knowing what to expect. For the first 4 years, almost nothing visible happens above the soil. A farmer waters it daily, fertilizes the ground, tends to it with consistent care, and sees what looks like almost no progress at all, just a small shoot sitting stubbornly at nearly the same height season after season. Anyone unfamiliar with this particular plant would reasonably assume something has gone wrong, that the effort is being wasted, that perhaps the soil is bad, or the approach is flawed. Then, in the 5th year, that same bamboo shoots upward with astonishing speed, growing dozens of feet within a matter of weeks. What actually happened during those 4 seemingly quiet years was not stagnation. The plant was building an enormous root system underground, invisible to anyone watching only the surface, a foundation strong enough to support the explosive growth that would eventually follow. Your effort works the same way, far more often than you're told. This is one of the hardest truths to accept about meaningful change, and it's exactly why so many people quit at precisely the moment they were closest to a breakthrough they couldn't yet see. Progress in almost every domain worth pursuing, health, skill, relationships, financial stability, inner peace, does not arrive in a smooth, visible, steadily climbing line. It arrives in fits and starts, with long, invisible stretches where nothing appears to be happening on the surface, followed by sudden, sometimes dramatic shifts that only become possible because of everything quietly built during those invisible stretches. The reason this matters so much is because human beings are wired to seek immediate feedback, and the absence of that feedback triggers a very specific, very convincing doubt. When you put in consistent effort and see no visible reward, your mind naturally begins constructing an explanation, and unfortunately, the explanation it reaches for first is almost always the wrong one. It concludes that the effort isn't working, that the approach must be flawed, that perhaps you simply don't have what it takes. This conclusion feels utterly reasonable in the moment, but it is frequently false, and acting on it, by quitting right at that point, guarantees you never discover what would have happened if you'd continued just a little further. Understanding what's actually happening beneath the visible surface changes how tolerable the invisible period becomes. In physical training, for example, the body undergoes genuine cellular adaptation, changes in muscle fiber, changes in cardiovascular efficiency, long before any of these changes become visible in the mirror or measurable on a scale. In learning a new skill, the brain forms and strengthens neural pathways through repetition long before that skill feels natural or automatic to perform. In building any meaningful relationship, trust accumulates slowly through countless small, unremarkable interactions long before it becomes obvious or is ever tested by a real crisis. In every one of these cases, the invisible work is not separate from the visible result. It is the actual substance the visible result is made of. Removing the invisible stage does not speed up the process. It simply prevents the process from ever completing at all. A practical shift that helps enormously during these invisible stretches is changing what you actually measure. Most people measure only the final outcome: weight lost, dollars earned, followers gained, pages published, and when that outcome remains flat for an extended period, discouragement sets in quickly. Instead, measure the input you actually control. Did you show up today? Did you do the work you committed to doing, regardless of what the scoreboard currently shows? This shift matters because outcomes are influenced by many factors outside your control, including timing that has nothing to do with the quality of your effort, while inputs are entirely within your control every single day. A person who tracks consistent input rather than fluctuating output maintains motivation far longer through invisible periods, because they have concrete daily proof that they are doing exactly what needs to be done, even while the results remain stubbornly hidden. Set checkpoints based on time and effort rather than on results, and commit to those checkpoints in advance, before doubt has a chance to creep in and renegotiate the terms. Decide, at the very start of a difficult pursuit, that you will maintain consistent effort for a specific period, perhaps 6 months, a year, whatever feels appropriate to the scale of what you're attempting, regardless of what results appear or fail to appear along the way. This advance commitment matters enormously because it removes the ongoing, exhausting decision of whether to continue that would otherwise have to be made fresh every single discouraging day. The decision was already made once, clearly, during a moment when your judgment wasn't clouded by frustration or fatigue. Seek out evidence from others who have walked a similar invisible stretch before you, not for comparison, but for genuine reassurance that the pattern you're experiencing is normal, rather than a sign of unique personal failure. Almost every person who has achieved something meaningful can point to a specific period where nothing seemed to be working, where doubt was loud and constant, and where continuing required a kind of stubborn faith in a process they couldn't yet see the results of. Hearing these stories does not guarantee your own invisible period will resolve identically, but it does confirm that the pattern itself, quiet effort followed eventually by visible breakthrough, is common enough to trust, rather than rare enough to dismiss as false hope. Consider someone learning a new language, showing up daily for practice, feeling for months as though nothing is sticking, as though every conversation still requires painful, halting effort with no sign of the fluency they're working toward. What's actually happening beneath the surface is real, measurable neural development, vocabulary being stored, grammar patterns being absorbed, listening comprehension slowly strengthening, none of it obvious in daily practice, but all of it accumulating steadily. Then, often without warning, a shift occurs. A conversation flows more naturally than expected. A show is understood without subtitles for the first time. A thought arrives directly in the new language, rather than through translation. This shift did not happen because of that particular day's practice session. It happened because of every invisible session that came before it, finally reaching a threshold where the change became visible. Consider someone building a small business, working consistently for a year with minimal revenue to show for the effort, watching savings dwindle while wondering whether the entire pursuit was a mistake. Beneath the surface, though, real assets are accumulating that don't yet appear as revenue, an audience slowly growing, product quality steadily improving through iteration, industry relationships quietly forming, personal expertise deepening with every problem solved along the way. Businesses that eventually succeed rarely show a smooth upward line from day one. They show exactly this pattern, a long invisible foundation building period, followed by a period of visible acceleration, made possible entirely by what was built during the quiet stretch beforehand. Consider someone working through years of personal therapy, showing up weekly, doing the difficult internal work, and feeling for a long stretch as though nothing about their patterns has genuinely changed, that they still react the same way to old triggers, still carry the same core wounds they started with. Then, one day, in a moment that would have once triggered an old destructive pattern, something different happens. A pause occurs where there once was none. A calmer response emerges where explosive reaction used to live automatically. This shift did not appear from nowhere. It grew from every seemingly unproductive session that preceded it, slowly restructuring patterns that took years to form and were never going to dissolve overnight. Notice, across every one of these examples, a common structure. The invisible period is not a sign that the process has failed. It is the actual mechanism through which the process works. Confusing invisible progress with no progress at all is the single most common reason capable, hard-working people abandon pursuits that were closer to breakthrough than they realized. The tragedy is not usually a lack of ability or a lack of effort. The tragedy is quitting during the exact stretch that was quietly building toward the very results they wanted, simply because those results hadn't yet become visible. Build a specific practice to protect yourself against this exact trap. Keep a written record of your daily or weekly effort, entirely separate from any tracking of outcomes. When doubt arrives, and it will arrive regularly during any invisible stretch, return to this record as evidence, not of results achieved, but of consistent input delivered. This record becomes your anchor during the exact moments when motivation and visible proof are both absent, a reminder that showing up itself has value, independent of whether that value has become measurable yet. Trusting the process does not mean blind, unquestioning faith regardless of circumstances. It means trusting a process you have genuine reason to believe in, based on real understanding of how growth actually works, sustained through periods where the results simply haven't surfaced yet. The bamboo tree's roots do not stop growing just because nothing is visible above ground. Your effort works the same way, quietly building toward a threshold you cannot yet see, and the only real question is whether you will still be standing there, still watering the ground, when that threshold is finally reached.